goes Seventh-day Adventist education, goes the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Adventist education is not just about the academics. It is to help our people to become rooted and grounded in our beliefs in what Adventism is, and to be able to live it.
We are talking here about young minds that are very shapeable, you know. They are being molded and shaped, impacted, absorbing of what comes, hungry. That we can instill within these minds values which will help them to be and to function and to live for the kingdom of God.
Salvation isn't just something that will happen at some time in the future. The gift that God gives us is for this life as well. To be able to be a blessing in this life, to help others, to live healthier, happy lives, to have happy marriages. These are blessings that God wants us to have. And so when Ellen White said the work of education, the work of redemption is one, it is the same work.
Nós não somos uma rede de educação qualquer. Nós somos uma rede de educação confessional que tem por objetivo ensinar para a vida, mas preparar para a eternidade. Então aí vem o equilíbrio, como fazer tudo isso, porque se nós não fizermos tudo isso, os pais não têm interesse na nossa escola, eles querem um lugar que prepare, que lance os filhos para o futuro, que tenha qualidade acadêmica. Mas vem o desafio de trazer esse outro lado, que os pais muitas vezes não veem, mas que nós como igreja precisamos ter muito claro, nós temos uma missão. E a missão é preparar para a vida, mas é colocar Jesus no coração de cada menino e de cada menina que passa pelas nossas escolas. E a grande meta que nós temos hoje é fortalecer um lado e encontrar ainda mais energias para colocar no outro. A vida espiritual, o cumprimento da missão e levar cada um desses garotas e garotos aos pés de Jesus.
Desde sus más humildes inicios, la educación adventista ha crecido hasta convertirse hoy en una de las redes educativas más grandes del mundo. Pero este privilegio viene también con grandes desafíos y con la responsabilidad de llevar el mensaje de la filosofía de la educación adventista a cada ser que esté dispuesto a aprender a los pies del gran Maestro Jesús.
Ellen White said that we have nothing to fear for the future except that we should forget the way the Lord has led us in our past. Many of the lessons from our past can help us with current problems. We reference campuses that were lost and how God turned it for good. There were pressures back then to conform to what the secular standard was, and we saw that with American Medical Missionary College, so that eventually it became part of a state university and today doesn't exist anymore. Those are lessons we have to remember as we face with the challenges of growth. Our greatest challenges really come from the growth. We are growing so fast, so popular, there's always the pressure to conform, to make some compromises, financially, to admit students, to hire teachers who don't really understand our philosophy, to not work with those teachers to be able to understand what the philosophy is. So we should look back and see what lessons were learned there, what we can do, and recommit again to those core values.
The greatest challenge we have is to keep our major focus. In a world in which most of the professors in most places now have earned doctoral degrees, it's too easy to think of education as being intellectual. No, it's not just intellectual. The spiritual aspect is important, and many of our schools, most of our schools, are doing an excellent job on that.
Along with those challenges that have always been with us, remaining faithful to our scriptural-based beliefs, remaining faithful to Jesus, maintaining our identifying marks, believing that Jesus is coming again, the Sabbath being a sign between God and us, attesting to His creation. All of these remain. And then there are challenges that are characteristic of modern day society. Secularism, consumerism, materialism, globalization. That is a good thing, but in ways challenge the thinking and pose obstacles for education in general, Adventist education in particular.
I think there's a lot of that heritage that still remains at the core of what we do, but also life has changed, expectations have changed, students have changed. And so I think the whole secularism and materialism of society really impacts our capacity to deliver Adventist education. Before, students were willing to work multiple hours, parents sacrificed a lot. Nowadays, education has become so expensive, and it's much harder to do everything in the way it was in the past. And so that threatens, I think, some of the ideals of giving that option for everybody, because people just say, I can't afford it.
We must find ways to provide Seventh-day Adventist teachers. We must find ways to provide Adventist school structures or structures somewhere into which we can bring Adventist education. We should also, as we did in the early days, interact more with those educators and scholars or researchers outside Adventism so that we influence more, that we share. That's what it's about. We were supposed all along to share what God has given us. I think we need to do a better job at that. We get so busy. Usually it boils down to that. We just get so busy just trying to keep up with the immediate work that we don't reach as far as we should. We must find ways to do that. And then it is important that we somehow get our churches to go back to those early days. You'll rarely hear me say anything about going back, but there are elements of principle from those days that we must pull forward. Not the ways of doing things, but the principles. And the early principles of Adventist education included an awareness that the schools were not just the responsibility of the educators and the parents, but the entire congregation in a given locale. The entire congregation was responsible for and enjoyed the benefits of the educational institution. All children were all of our children. If I had no children, I still would have a responsibility for providing Adventist education for those children who are in the church or closely associated with the church. We need to get back to that in many ways. We need to be able to make Adventist education more affordable. And there are debates on all sides of that. Some say, oh, it's affordable and people spend money where they choose to spend money. Some say that it's just beyond their reach, and if they are to survive, that is to have food, clothing, and shelter, they cannot afford the expenses. But if we all believe that all of our children shall be taught of the Lord and that it's all of our responsibility, together we have enough resources to provide for all of our children and to provide the resources necessary for all of our institutions.
Persuadidos de que una educación sin Dios es incompleta y que la Biblia es la única e infalible guía correcta, los pioneros de la educación adventista decidieron fundar un sistema educativo forjado por una ideología, pero fortalecido por una convicción, una certeza que para permitir su subsistencia debe ser renovada
de generación en generación.
I've seen some people making some choices, people who in the olden days would have sent their children to Adventist schools. And now they're distracted by the school that has all the best programs, or the school that they think is most likely to get their child into Stanford or Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford or whatever place you value. They also may not understand why they should sacrifice to make this happen. Perhaps they don't understand that when you sacrifice to make it happen, things often do work out, even if you don't think you have enough. But in some cases, the people who are not sending their children to Adventist schools can certainly afford it, but they're choosing not to do so.
I did a qualitative study and went around and asked parents why they weren't sending their children or why they stopped sending their children. And this is what I heard. After we talked about the financial challenges of sending their children to private education, they really said, well, they weren't sure that their kids were getting as quality an education as they might in another school system. So I said to them, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, we don't. Do you have any evidence to prove otherwise? And I had to say to them, no, we didn't. Not on a large scale, not on a comprehensive scale. So I said, maybe that's what we ought to do as a School of Education here at La Sierra, is to find out exactly how our kids are doing all across the North American division, which includes Canada and Bermuda. So that began the Cognitive Genesis study, and we did a 4-year longitudinal study. So it wasn't just a snapshot, but for 4 years we tracked students to see how they did in the 4 years. And it involved quite a lot, because when you think we had 900 schools then, over 50,000 students or more actually, and we had to do that for 4 years and get the cooperation of their schools, their principals, their parents, and the students themselves. And we had to test them on standardized tests for achievement and ability. So it was a huge project. And I have to say, some people thought that it was impossible. But with God's help, nothing is really impossible. And so I just felt like God was with us all the way, and eventually we successfully completed the project. We tested students in grades 3 through 9 and then 11. Grade 3 is the earliest that we test students in the Adventist system. And this is what we found. We found that students in Adventist schools scored above the national average in all subjects and in all grades. Now, all subjects and in all grades. That's quite an astounding finding, actually. And then what we found was the longer that they're in an Adventist school, the higher the achievement and the higher the ability. Now, that is a very unusual finding for ability, because ability doesn't usually change that much. It may stay around like this. But our kids who are in our schools for 8 years, 7 or 8 years, it goes up like this, both ability and achievement. So we're calling that the Adventist school effect. The longer they're in our schools, the better their achievement and the better their ability. And another remarkable thing was that students performed beyond what was predicted by their individual ability. So for instance, if Joey's ability is here, his teacher and his parents would hope that the achievement is here. But in fact, in our schools, the achievement is here. So students are performing above what's predicted by their ability. And I like to say to parents that wouldn't they like to have their child in a school where the teacher says, Joey is a child of God, and I'm committed to developing Joey's God-given ability. And that's exactly what happens in Adventist schools across North American Division. Now, if I had to point to one subject that we do particularly well in, it would be science. And some people are a little bit surprised at that because they say, how could that be? You have a curriculum that's based on God as creator. The theme of creation runs throughout the science curriculum. How can kids learn good science when they believe God is the creator and in creation? But in fact, that's one of our highest grades subjects. And also, scientific inquiry is one of our highest sub-areas. I want to think about that within the context of what Ellen White says in education. She says that true education develops thinkers, not mere reflectors of other people's thoughts. Scientific inquiry shows that kids in our schools are thinking. They're asking questions and they're thinking.
Educar es redimir. Esta es la esencia de la verdadera educación. Restaurar al ser humano a la imagen de su creador, promoviendo el desarrollo de su mente, cuerpo y alma, a fin de que viva una vida completa, dando el ejemplo, transmitiendo valores, colocando sus dones al servicio de otros, ejercitando una fe activa que lo mantendrá firme en la esperanza. Esperanza que da vida, certeza de que vendrá un mundo mejor.
We've worked on a project for 20 years now called Value Genesis. We started in 1990. We did the research with Adventist students in Adventist schools and Adventist students in public education with their parents, their teachers, their administrators, their pastors, and we looked at what their faith, their values, and what their commitments were. And we did it again in 2000, and we did it again in 2010, so we've had 3 iterations of Value Genesis research to see the trends in Adventist education and in the generations of young people. This is a generational study. We have 3 separate generations of Adventist young people from grades 6 to grades 12. And so now we can look back over these 20 years, 3 studies, and see what trends there are in education. And there's some unique trends. We looked at faith and values and commitments. We looked at their piety, their personal piety. Adventist students overwhelmingly see themselves committed to Jesus Christ. They pray regularly. They attend church more regularly than their parents do. They find themselves going out and doing community service and volunteering in ways that never happened before. We have a huge short-term mission program in our schools, and we have a lot of young people involved in that. And so we've learned over the years that our young people are great young people. They're safer in Adventist schools. They don't get involved in at-risk behavior as much. We have all the same kinds of problems the secular schools have, but we have them in much less degree in terms of percentages. So the schools are a safe place to be. And we know that when we asked the students this time, in the last study, we had 29 choices of things that might have impacted their faith as they went through schools from grade 6 through 12 in their schools. And this year, for the first time, attending a quality Christian school, an Adventist school, was the very first thing they picked as influencing their faith. So that was a pretty powerful, especially when you realize that the schools are competing with mothers and grandparents, and all those are important in building a person's faith.
As I think of where I want my children to be in their lives, I want them to be in a place where God is the very center of their lives. That's not likely to happen somewhere else. In fact, there are likely to be distractions somewhere else. I want them to have the best choices possible to choose God. And our data that we have gathered through the Value Genesis study and the Cognitive Genesis studies, and those were very scary studies to do because we were asking, is Adventist education worth it? Is church worth it in students' lives? And we didn't know what the results would be. Both of those show that when home and school, Adventist school and church work together, your child is likely to stay in the church during their lives, through their lives, and that when your child is in Adventist school, they actually not only achieve better than the norm of students in secular schools, but their abilities also increase. So we've done an achievement test to say, how do they perform? And we've done ability tests to say, what are their abilities to learn? And both of them show that students who go to Adventist schools do better. We have enough data now that shows that Adventist education is strong and solid, that you can't make that argument anymore, that another school will make them better academically. In fact, I have seen students come all the way through our elementary schools, our high schools, and even through college, and then apply for their postgraduate studies at places like Stanford and Harvard and Purdue and Oxford, and they go. These schools like to have them. So I would say to you, you want to send your child to an ultra prestigious private school where they'll go to Stanford. What is your desire for your child's spiritual commitments in life? What is your desire for your child's ability to be friends with the other people in the pews at church? What do you see there that would be better for them academically?
In a postmodern world, people with postmodern attitudes and philosophies think that everything is relative. So they don't believe in maybe absolutes. They take a more relative view of things. And also I think one of the challenges I notice is that maybe parents or young parents are placing values somewhere else. And so there's a buy-in to secular values. For instance, I want my kid to go to a prestigious school, an Ivy League school, and how can he do that if he's going to go to a small Adventist school?
Today, too often, we're more interested in getting our young people into Harvard than maybe into heaven. The pioneers, and even my generation, my parents, that generation, they would give up a vacation. They would give up buying a new car. They would give up buying a new home or new clothes. Why? Because they wanted to make certain that their children had the very best possible opportunity to decide for Christ and be ready to go to heaven that they could provide. And so if it meant sacrificing for them on their own things so that they could give a Christian education to the young people, why, that was what was paramount. Now, unfortunately today, at least for some, it seems like if I can get a new car, and if I can go to Europe for vacation, and if I can buy a new house, if there's all that and some money left, then I'll put them in Adventist education. My children in Adventist education. That's not the way it was in the early days. The primary thing was, I want my children in heaven. And the best way I know to get them there is to give them a Christian education.
Herencia de Dios son los hijos. Responsabilidad intransferible que inscribe a quien la asume en una carrera interminable de altruismo y entrega. Antídoto para el egoísmo, reflejo del amor de un Salvador. Tarea cotidiana de consecuencias eternas, decisiones diarias que determinarán el éxito o el fracaso en esta que es la misión más importante de la vida.
Any parent would want to know that their child, every aspect of their child is being developed. Not just the cognitive, but the physical and the spiritual as well. And that nowadays, if they look at the research, it's not cognition that contributes to success, it's character. And the research shows that. So if they want their kids to really be successful, they want to take their kids to a school that is developing character as well as stuff up here, you know? So now we've shown that we can develop the stuff up here. Now we need to show them that we are, in fact, most interested in character development. And in our schools, that's happening in every day on our campus.
Necesitamos que los niños y jóvenes acumulen el conocimiento, pero por sobre todo, que sepan quiénes son, de dónde vienen y a dónde van. Debemos capacitarlos para que sepan tomar decisiones sabias, para que luchen por sus convicciones y sean leales a los principios bíblicos. Nuestros alumnos deben aprender a conocer y amar a Dios, a serle fiel y prepararse para brindar un servicio útil tanto a Él como a la humanidad.
We need to keep all three parts of our aim in mind. The intellectual, vocational training, what all, even secular institutions do. The spiritual aspect, which other Christian institutions do, but the specifically Adventist aspect. Those two things plus the great understanding of the apocalyptic vision, the great controversy theology.
It gives them a view of where they fit in this universe. If you have the great controversy story, and we teach that in Adventist education, you know that God is big and powerful, and yet He loves me. And so I have a special place in His universe. You know that God is filling the entire universe, and yet He wants me to be someone who treats His other children well. He wants me to be a person who does the best that I can do. He wants me to be interested in always learning my whole entire life. And He's hoping that I'll make the choice that will show His character, because that's the great controversy story. And our choice then affects not only our own future, but our choices also affect the view that others have of God. And so when we see that, we, each one of us, have an extremely important place, an extremely important role to play in this whole story of God. We are in God's story. And He's so amazing that He's also in our story.
Tan sorprendente como un Dios eterno interesado en la efímera historia humana, es un Dios grandioso, preocupado por cada ser humano, por más pequeño que sea. Conocer nuestra historia es más que informarse sobre el pasado, es formar un marco de referencia para concebir un mejor futuro. Y así, al conocer este pequeño fragmento de la grandiosa historia de la educación adventista, reconocer que formamos parte de ella, que pertenecemos a algo más grande y que nuestra historia, cuando es parte de la historia de Dios, es un don inmensurable y eterno.
En los más de 100 años que componen la historia de la educación adventista, hubieron desafíos y victorias. Momentos malos y buenos, pero que compartieron una misma constante, la presencia de Dios. Este maestro con mayúscula, que no se olvidó de estos profesores apasionados y de estos padres que confiados entregaron a sus hijos en manos de la educación adventista. Esta educación diferente, que no solamente se preocupa por el presente, sino que aún hoy establece un compromiso con el futuro.